What's up, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Falcons Final Whistle podcast presented by Zaxby's. I'm Scott Bair, alongside, as always, Terrin Waack and Tori McElhaney. And joining us for the first time ever, another one of our writers. I'm sure that you've read her work on AtlantaFalcons.com. Amna Subhan is going to join us. Hello and welcome.
Hey, y'all. Happy to be here alongside you.
And we're going to come to Amna later on to discuss the Falcons injury situation and everything that she wrote for an article that's up on the website about how the Falcons' depth was definitely tested. It was tested and it ultimately came through, but the Falcons as a team did not. They ended up losing to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers 29-25 here on Sunday at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, where we are talking to you right now. And this was a big one. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The Falcons had a one-game advantage in the NFC South and had an opportunity to create separation within the division and be the pace car for the NFC South to go a game above 500 and fight for that above 500 more respectable record. Ultimately, what happened was a loss that really has muddied the waters. Now the Falcons, Bucs, and New Orleans Saints are all sitting at 6-7. And things got a lot more complicated after this one. Tori, you wrote about this, and I think that you're ultimately right. There's a lot of people, I think, who are holding up their hands saying that I'm accountable. I think you could point fingers, but you shouldn't, that this loss is on the entire team.
Yeah, it was Arthur Smith after the game who said, we're not into playing the blame game. And I agree with that because when it comes to this game, there was a lot of blame to go around. And I think every single unit from offense to defense to special teams had a moment or multiple moments where there was a miscue or a mistake that ultimately took points off the board, or in the defense's perspective, allowed the Bucs to put points on the board. So for me, when you are looking at the grand scope of this game, Younghoe Koo misses 2 field goals. That's 6 points. He said in the locker room, and I know Terrin's going to talk about this later, but said in the locker room, that's on me. I feel like this loss is on me. So he says that. And then this offense goes an entire third quarter without being able to put any type of points on the board, despite the fact that they had really, really good field position on 3 of those 4 drives in the third quarter. Then there's the safety. Then there's the interception that ultimately set up the Bucs' first touchdown. And then there's the defense, who I thought played very, very well up until the last quarter, when you really needed them to stand on what they were standing on for the first 3 quarters. And they ultimately give up a what goes on to be a game-winning touchdown for the Bucs. And from top to bottom, I felt like it was a disappointing outing. And, guys in the locker room talked about how this one stings, this one's frustrated, like we're frustrated. And I think those are the right words to describe this, especially because the goal of today was to sit atop the NFC South unimpeded with other teams. That's not what happened. The Falcons are now they're still atop the NFC South, but with the Saints and the Bucs. That's not really a top. So I think that's kind of where this game has landed us. And it's a disappointing feeling for a team that I thought, perhaps was picking up steam in the last 2 weeks, having beaten the Saints and beaten the Jets.
I'd partially like to say I called it last week. I said this game is beyond important because of the repercussions it could have, not only in the standings, but also like mental and emotional confidence, because they still haven't strung together 3 wins in a row. And now they're also in a 3-way quote unquote tie for the NFC South, which is bonkers to me. Let's begin with that. So this loss, it feels heavier than the other losses, in my opinion. Maybe it kind of rivals the 3rd in a row when it came right before the bye.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's fair. And the more that you think about this all 3 phases thing, you throw an interception deep in your own territory that leads
turnover.
That ultimately leads to points. And this defense, for as much praise as it's gotten, and deservedly so, they've given up decisive 4th quarter touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 games. And you can say all you want about, okay, like they are doing better. They are tough to play against. They have lots of stats that that tell you that this is a good unit. But there are ways to close out games, and the Falcons defense hasn't been doing enough of that. And there are lots of little moments where things leak out and ultimately results in losses that, frankly, the Falcons expect to win. And I'm sure everyone's sick of me bringing this up at this point because
Oh boy.
I feel like I bring up this Caden Ellis quote all the time, probably 3 straight pods now, but I think it's so important because during that 3-game losing streak, he said, we expected to go on a run after we beat Tampa Bay. They lose 3 in a row. Calais Campbell said after this one, they expected to win this game. They walked in feeling like they could have and should have beat this team despite all the injuries, which we'll get to later, that there was a real sense that they're going to take this division and really take control of it. And that's ultimately not what happened. And look, nobody cares about style points. Nobody cares about outside respectability or fun, ridiculous memes on social media. But there was also an opportunity here for the Falcons to go on a run, win 3 in a row, and really add some respectability to this NFC South. And what you get now is you get a bunch of memes where there's 3 teams below 500 and one of them gets to host a playoff game. The Falcons shouldn't give back that opportunity, but they need to start playing better if they are going to assert themselves. And last part of my rant, but so much at the end of the last few seasons, we've heard a lot about the Falcons being in quote unquote playoff contention or fighting for a spot, right? But really what that was they need a late game surge and a lot of help. They were finally at a position where they didn't need any help. They just had to take control of their own destiny, take control of this division. Ultimately, that's not what happened. And I think that should constitute a disappointment and frustration and all of these other words that you've heard. Everything is still out there in front of them, but now it becomes who can finish better. Saints, Bucs, or Falcons at this point. And every game, like Jesse Bates said, every game essentially is a playoff game to this point. That's a slight exaggeration that shouldn't be taken literally, but I get his point. That has to be the mentality moving forward.
I agree. No notes on your rant. No notes on that rant.
So let's dive a little bit farther into somebody who's been automatic for this team and is so trustworthy and confidence inspiring, and that's kicker Younghoe Koo. Missed 2 field goals that started a run of unsuccessful possessions. They went missed field goal, safety, missed field goal, and then 4 consecutive punts until they got to the 4th quarter. Younghoe raised his hand and said, hey, this one's on me. Did that surprise you at all?
No, just because knowing his character, I'm not surprised that he kind of took the blame for it. Maybe I'm surprised a little bit how blunt he was about us, being like, quote, I cost us today. That's all me, end quote. But he was put in not ideal situations, which Desmond Ridder acknowledged, saying we shouldn't be putting him at 50 plus yards every single time he has to kick a field goal, because the 2 kicks he missed were from 50 and 52 yards out. The only other field goal he had missed this year was 50 something. Tori, what is it?
I thought it was 48 or 43 in Detroit.
47. I found it in my story. 47. Yeah. I just assumed it was over 50 because otherwise Koo is clutch. He's 3 for 3 from beyond the 50-yard mark this season, actually. So yeah, the only other one he has missed this season was a 47-yarder during the loss to the Lions, but that's 3 kicks this season alone. This was only the 2nd time in his entire career he's missed more than 1 field goal in a single game. And the only other time was a rookie when he was with the Chargers. So it's been a really pretty minute since he's done this, that I'm sure he's feeling pretty down, but that's probably why he took the L personally. But everyone has always praised Younghoe so much of just getting back into routine and sticking to his fundamentals and moving on from any mistakes.
And look, I don't think Younghoe is sitting there like trying to make excuses or anything like that. I'm not going to sit here and make any excuses either. You know that Younghoe Koo wants to go out and be as automatic as what we've kind of known him to be. And Drake London in the locker room, we were talking to him and he was like, I'm not worried about Younghoe. He was like,
no one is.
Yeah. He was like, he's automatic. And I consider this to be a fluke. You know, some people just have bad days. Heck, I feel like I have just as many bad days as you have good days, you know, like
bad weeks, bad months.
Yeah, that's just how life is. And it's the same for, NFL kickers. But in Younghoe's defense, and this goes back to what I was saying before, the Falcons had way more opportunities than just those missed field goals to put points on the board. And it's something that we've been talking about this entire season. Touchdowns, not field goals. There are so many games that this Falcons team, it's come down to a kick because they couldn't get in the end zone. It's come down to one score and they're not able to get in the end zone. And like that's the frustrating part to this is, yes, Younghoe Koo needs to make those field goals. He knows that. Everybody knows that. We're not discounting that. But again, you can't have this offense in the third quarter just not show up, which there have been many times in the third quarter where this team has struggled offensively to score. And when you're not putting points on the board beyond 3 points, that's not necessarily a recipe for success. You've got to get in the end zone.
I mean, the pendulum swings both ways. If Younghoe makes both those field goals, they win. But say instead of that one field goal he did make, that was a touchdown, swings back the other way. If my math checks out on the spot.
But
they would have been tied, but then they could have done something. And it's not as simple as saying like, hey, he makes those, they win. That would mean everything else has to go the exact same. That's not how this would work because then momentum would have built. So it's just not as simple as saying, you make those, game is a completely different outcome.
Yeah, and ultimately the Falcons have been relatively fortunate when it comes to health outside of losing Troy Anderson and Grady Jarrett for the season, which are two huge blows. But they've been weathering a real injury storm lately now that we're going to bring Amna back in. They were playing at one point with Matt Bergeron as their only starter along the offensive line. That generally spells trouble. What was said post game about how they were able to deal with all these injury issues?
The things that were said post game are very similar to what we hear every day at the practice facility. If you go to, pop up any presser, whether that's Ryan Nielsen or Arthur Smith or any player, they'll tell you that they treat everybody like a starter. It's next man up mentality. This is the NFL. There are injuries. I mean, today it got a little bit like, okay, that's a little bit too much. But that's exactly what they said. Chris Lindstrom, who exited shortly, talked a lot about how, we've had hundreds of reps with these guys. And he was just happy that guys like Ryan Newsel, who got his first start, and Storm Norton, who came in, and Tyler Vrabel, who was elevated from the practice squad, got a chance to show what they can do on the field and show that they've been doing this, throughout the whole entire season on the practice field. But yeah, it was there was a ton of injuries, and that just is not going to help you. And then
there were what, 4 during the game as well to kind of add to that thing. It's one thing where you can kind of prep during the week. It's another if bam, sudden change and you're all of a sudden in there. What about you also talked to Clark Phillips. What was his kind of take after what I thought was a pretty good game?
Yeah, he said that he feels like he embodies that that mentality and embodies the fact basically where they're at in this point of the season, to the point where there is just like a Matt Bergeron as one starter in there, and he came in last game for AJ Terrell, and then this game played opposite AJ Terrell. And he had a pretty impressive game, like you said, and just had that, that one penalty that didn't cost him the entire touchdown at the end there, but that's just the way it goes, I suppose.
Now, the real question is how much of this stuff is going to be long-term. We don't have a good grasp of any of those things yet. We're going to have to see imaging and stuff like that. But there's a lot of missing pieces. I think they miss Caleb McGarry in the run game. I feel like they miss Nate Landman's physicality on the interior, though Andre Smith didn't play half bad either. But you lose your Iron Man, Jake Matthews, and Tyler Vrabel has to step in. Ultimately, the one thing that I did like, not like I would expect it any other way, but there was everybody was hurt. That's why we didn't win. Like I didn't hear a lot of excuses come out of that locker room. And I think that's pretty important as they move forward.
Yeah, absolutely not. And even, Tyler Algier said that I trust every single one of those guys on the line, no matter who it is. And I'm not going to feel any differently.
And
Desmond Ritter said the same thing.
Yeah, and like all those things I think are important. Another big blow was actually the fact that interior defensive lineman Kentavia Street was lost to a shoulder injury, but before he went out, he was able to get a sack, which is good news for Atlanta area Falcons fans, because this podcast is brought to you by Zaxby's. Since the Falcons did sack an opposing quarterback, you can go to any Atlanta area Zaxby's for a buy one, get one big Zax snack meal the day after the game. So on Monday, for those of you listening right now, use the code ATLSAC23. That was the only opportunity, that was the only sack of the game, despite the fact that they were able to get pressure on and around Baker Mayfield. I thought they did a good job with dealing with Mike Evans and shadowing coverage, because Mike Evans has been a real thorn in their side. I think AJ Terrell shadowed him a little bit, but ultimately when you look at it, and this is like Tori's least favorite phrase of the year, maybe, is like missed opportunities, right? That was used a lot. But I think this is one of those things where if you're looking at the evidence presented, and of course you have to give the Bucs credit, but ultimately I think a lot of these wounds were self-inflicted, and some of these, everything is its own story. But I go back to that interception early on that gave Bucs possession in the red zone, and I think those are the types of critical mistakes that you can't have. Now, look, Desmond Ritter made some amazing throws, and Drake London was awesome, right? But I think too often they're hurting themselves. That so much of this stuff is self-inflicted.
There was a point, and I want to say it was right before halftime, where I tweeted out, the only thing standing in Atlanta's way in this game is Atlanta.
Yeah.
And I stand by that now, 2 quarters later at the end of the game, feeling that way still. I completely agree that there were so many missed opportunities. That's a phrase that we hear over and over and over again, that it's either there are too many missed opportunities or the moments where the Falcons didn't play to the best of their ability was that it accumulated towards the loss. Like, those are the running themes of this season, I feel like, when we're talking about losses for this team. And today was no different. And they needed this win. And in a way that I kind of go back to what Terrin was talking about before, that felt a little bit different than maybe some of the other games that they played. I remember going into the Saints game and feeling like that game had such potential to alter how you felt about the season. And I don't necessarily think that changes with the Bucs loss, but it changes the way that the next 4 weeks kind of roll out for you, because the Bucs hold the tiebreaker at this moment. And so it's like you go and do all you can do, but if the Bucs hold a tiebreaker over you, what else what else can you do? So
the missed opportunity, just throw it in the bag.
I just I hate that term, and it's getting old for me. And
yeah, because at what point do you stop using it? At what point do you just acknowledge the fact that these aren't necessarily missed opportunities, but more so like, maybe this is where they're at. They're 6-7.
Yeah, and I think Arthur Smith has said it many times before, where he says the record and said, yeah, this is where we are, and this is where obviously we should be, because this is our record. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating to hear that word those words missed opportunities over and over again. And I know that they probably don't want to keep using them in the locker room, and Arthur Smith doesn't want to keep using it at the podium. But if that's what it is, that's what it is. I don't know. I'm just having a hard time with that phrasing at this point.
I agree. I completely agree.
Yeah, because ultimately, just like the phrase critical mistakes, you look at it, and that's just we're in week 14. That's part of what the Falcons are in this iteration, is that not taking enough advantage, and that's why we're sitting here at this late of a date, and everything is so kind of muddied in the NFC South.
Well, this is in this game. I literally tweeted this not too long ago. The Falcons outgained the Bucs 434 total yards to 290. the only thing you can point back to be like, oh, this is why we lost, are the turnovers, the missed field goals, the giving up the touchdown in the last minute of the game. To look at the total yards, to look at the stat line, it's like the stat line doesn't necessarily point to all that was that game, because if you're just looking at the stat line of total yardage, the Falcons should have won by 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, and I think ultimately one thing that I did want to address, or at least discuss before we get out of here, is that I think shows the emotional magnitude of this game, how important it was for the Falcons. There was something that I thought Tori captured well in her story that nobody can read in a box score or saw on the broadcast feed. It was something everybody saw the play at the end. Desmond Ritter throws a fastball to Drake London, trying to win the game essentially as time expires. He ends up just a couple yards short, and then that's when the broadcast breaks away, right? But that's not. But Tori, kind of fill us in on what Drake London did after that I think really expresses how much these guys wanted it and how disappointed they are that they ultimately didn't get it.
Yeah, so as everybody's, going out to the middle of the field to shake hands and all that, and Drake London just doesn't move. He stands up and he's on the 5-yard line, and he just does it. He's bent over, hands on his knees. He takes a couple of breaths. He stands up. He's talking to Kyle Pitts. Then Kyle Pitts walks away. It's just Drake London standing on the 5-yard line, essentially where this game ended for Atlanta. And he's just breathing. He's just standing there. And it was almost like a post-loss stupor is kind of how I explained it. And then it was probably, I said it was 3.5 minutes is kind of when I looked down at my clock on my phone. And when I look back, and when then it was Desmond Ritter walks over to him, and Des has a towel over his head. He taps Drake on the side. Des keeps walking, and finally it almost took Drake out of that stupor, and he walked towards the Falcons locker room. And it was a very stoic moment that I felt spoke volumes to the frustration of a guy like Drake London, who did everything he could have done to put the Falcons in the best position they could be in. This is a team sport. And it goes back to what I was saying before. You win as a team, you lose as a team. I know that's a cliche, and I hate using cliche. It's missed opportunities. I get that. But I will say Drake London had 172 receiving yards. The percentage that he alone had of the Falcons' total offensive yards was great. So for him to stand there on the 5-yard line, and visibly you can see the disappointment that he had to not get the next 3 yards to get into the end zone to essentially put the Falcons with a win instead of a loss, that hurt him. And I think this loss hurts the Falcons. And that's not something that I'm just sitting here saying. That's something that they said.
Yeah, I think this is a big moment for Falcons leadership. Now, in terms of the response and not having one loss turn into 2, Arthur Smith had a very good point when he said, just look at our actions over the course of the year and our actions during the practice week. And I don't have a doubt that they're going to be able to respond and work hard. We've seen those types of things. But I do think that it's important. And I think we saw evidence of it in the locker room where why am I escaping on the name? Calais Campbell was talking to Zach Harrison, trying to get his mind right. It was very clear that he was doing that with some of these younger players. And I think that's going to be important for their minds to be right, understanding next week's game at Carolina is essentially a must win at this point, and they've got to start building some positive momentum. They've got to start stacking these wins and really assembling it, because as you pointed out, ultimately they have to do better than New Orleans and Tampa and find a way to take control of this division. I think anything less than that, it's going to be a disappointment considering where they were at week 13. And if they end up anywhere except for first, I think that's not a good thing.
Yeah, just think about how we talked about the NFC South leading into this season.
Right.
It really did feel like if the Falcons were not at the top of this NFC South, when were they ever going to be at the top of this NFC South? Because that's just where this division is.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. Arthur Smith said that it's going to get crazy down the stretch. I have no doubt that he is correct. So we will come to you again after the Panthers game next week. So thank you so much for joining the Falcons Final Whistle podcast. Let's try to get this right. Please rate, review, subscribe to the Atlanta Falcons Podcast Network. And thanks again for joining the Final Whistle podcast presented by Zaxby's. I'm Scott. For Tori and Terrin and Amna, special guest, thank you so much for joining in. We will talk to you again after the Panthers game. See ya.